In the spring of 1893, on the shore of Lake Michigan, a city rose out of a swamp. 200 gleaming white palaces, a wheel that lifted 2,000 people into the sky, and after dark, something almost no one alive had ever seen, an entire city made of electric light. 27 million came to see it, and within a year, it was gone. What few of them knew was that 2 decades earlier, this same city had burned to the ground.
I'm Arthur, and tonight we're going to rebuild Chicago. From the ashes to the White City.
To understand the miracle, you first have to understand the ruin. Before 1871, Chicago was barely 40 years old, a raw, roaring boomtown thrown up on the mudflats of the prairie. It had grown faster than almost any city in human history, pulled out of the swamp by the railroads, the grain, the lumber, and the great river of cattle that flowed through its stockyards. It was a city built in a hurry, and built mostly of one thing: wood. Wooden houses, wooden sidewalks, wooden streets even. 1/3 of a million people living inside what was essentially kindling. And in October of 1871, the kindling caught. For 2 days and 2 nights, the fire moved through the city faster than a man could run. When it finally burned itself out at the edge of the lake, the heart of Chicago was simply gone. More than 17,000 buildings erased. The entire business district gone. Roughly 1/3 of the city had no home left to return to. People stood on the shore and watched the place they lived in turn to ash and smoke. This is where the story should end, with a broken city slowly licking its wounds. It didn't. Because Chicago did something that still astonishes historians. It did not wait, and it did not mourn for long. Within days, while the ruins were still warm, the city began to rebuild, and not as it had been. The land in the center was suddenly precious, and the soft ground beneath it was treacherous. The memory of the flames pushed builders away from timber, toward iron, and then toward something harder still: steel. A burned city had been handed a blank page, and out of that scarcity, out of that stubborn refusal to stay down, Chicago was about to give the world a way of building it had never seen before. It was about to learn how to touch the sky.
The problem was simple and almost unsolvable. In the rebuilt center of Chicago,
The patch of ground that would come to be called the Loop, land was suddenly worth a fortune. Every owner wanted more floors, more offices, more rent on the same small footprint. There was only one direction left to build: up. But you could not simply build up. In those days, a tall building held itself up with its own walls, thick walls of brick and stone that carried the weight of everything above them. The higher you wanted to climb, the thicker those walls had to be at the bottom. Push past a certain height, and the ground floor would have almost no room left, just a fortress of masonry with windows like arrow slits. The old way of building had hit a ceiling, so Chicago threw the old way out. The idea that broke the ceiling was deceptively simple. Instead of walls that carry the building, build a skeleton that carries it from within. A rigid cage of iron and steel, like the bones inside a body. Hang the walls onto that skeleton, and suddenly they don't have to hold anything up at all. They become a skin. They can be thin. They can be glass. In 1885, a building rose on a Chicago street using exactly this principle. A steel-framed tower of 10 stories that has long been credited as the world's first skyscraper. Historians still argue about whether it truly deserves that exact title, but the argument misses the point. Once Chicago had proven that a building could stand on a skeleton of steel, only one question was left: how high? A handful of architects raced to find out. They became known as the Chicago School, and one of them, Louis Sullivan, gave the new architecture its creed. 3 words that would shape the century to come: form follows function. Strip away the imitation and the ornament. Let a building be what it does. And so the city rose. Towers of steel wearing skins of glass and stone climbed over streets that a single generation earlier had been ash. An iron railway was thrown up on stilts above the downtown streets, carrying the crowds through the air. And before the decade was out, its tracks would ring the city's center in the great loop that names it to this day. And the crowds kept coming. In 1890, Chicago held just over 1 million people. 20 years later, it would hold more than 2 million, the second greatest city in America, nearly doubling within a generation. That same steel-born nerve, the willingness to build what no one had ever built before, was about to attempt something far larger than any single tower. Not an office, not a skyscraper, an entire city, raised on a swamp, built to make the whole world stop and stare.
In 1890, the United States went looking for a city to host a World's Fair.
A great exhibition to mark 400 years since Columbus reached the Americas. It was a matter of national pride, and the fiercest rival for the honor was New York. Chicago, the upstart, the burned city, the place the East still dismissed as a slaughterhouse on the prairie, fought for it. And Chicago won. The pride came with a challenge. 4 years earlier, Paris had held its own great fair and crowned it with a single unforgettable object, the Eiffel Tower. Now the world was watching to see what America could possibly build to answer it. Chicago had to make something the human race had never seen. There was only one problem. The site they chose, a place called Jackson Park on the lakefront, was a soggy, half-drowned marsh. Wind, water, sand, and reeds. By any reasonable judgment, it was the wrong place to build anything at all. They built it anyway. The man in charge was an architect named Daniel Burnham, and he ran the work like a general running a war. To tame the marsh, he brought in Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape genius behind New York's Central Park, and Olmsted set about draining the bog and carving it into lagoons and islands. An army of workers labored in the wet, knee-deep in mud that the day before had been swamp, racing a clock that would not stop. And out of that mud, in barely 2 years, they raised an entire city, close to 200 grand buildings, laid out along canals and basins like a vision out of ancient Rome. But here is the secret at the heart of it. The buildings were not made of marble. They couldn't be. There was no time and no money to carve a city out of stone for a fair that would last a single summer. So they were built of something else, a quick, cheap mixture of plaster, cement, and fiber, spread over wooden frames and painted a brilliant, gleaming white. From a few feet away, it looked like the most magnificent marble city on earth. They called it simply the White City. You walked in through a great court, and the white palaces rose around you and doubled themselves in the still water of a long basin. At one end stood a golden statue of a woman, tall as a church, her arms lifted over the water, burning in the sun. One of the halls was so enormous that it was, at the time, the largest building in the world ever raised under a single roof. People who had known only small towns and farmhouses walked inside it and forgot how to speak. And then there was the wheel. To answer the Eiffel Tower, the fair needed a marvel of its own, and a young engineer named George Ferris had an idea for one. He wanted to build a revolving wheel of steel taller than almost anything in the city that would carry people up into the sky and around again. When he proposed it, men laughed at him. They said he had a wheel in his head. They said a thing that size could never hold together, never turn, never be safe. He put his own money on the line, and he built it anyway. When it finally opened that summer, it stood 264 feet above the fairgrounds, and it lifted more than 2,000 people at a time, slowly into the air over Lake Michigan. They had told him it was impossible. Now the impossible was turning gently against the sky. But weeks before that wheel ever turned, on the 1st of May, President Grover Cleveland had laid his hand on a single golden key and brought the whole white city to life.
He turned the key, and the future switched on.
All across the grounds, water leapt from the fountains. Hidden engines shuddered awake. Flags climbed into the lake wind, and from a crowd of hundreds of thousands rose a roar that the people who heard it would carry to the end of their lives. And then you walked in. Imagine it. You step through the gates, and the noise and smoke of the real city fall away behind you. In front of you opens a great court, and around it stand the white palaces, vast, gleaming, perfect, each one doubled in the still mirror of the basin. At the far end, the golden woman rises as tall as a church, her arms lifted over the water. Boats slide down the canals, somewhere music, everywhere that impossible white. And remember who was walking there. This was a country of perhaps 65 million people, and over a single summer, close to half the nation would be drawn to this spot in one way or another, by train, by steamer, by the stories carried home. Most of them had spent their whole lives in small towns and on farms. They had never seen anything like this. No one had. Outside the gates, the real Chicago went on roaring, coal smoke, factory noise, crowded streets. But inside, for the price of a ticket, you could walk through a clean, white, ordered dream of what a city might one day become. People did not just look at the white city, they fell in love with it. And the white city was saving its greatest wonder for the dark. You have to understand what night meant in 1893. Most of the people walking those grounds had come from places still lit by candle and oil lamp. Electric light was a rumor to them, a novelty they had read about but never seen. To them, when the sun went down, the world was supposed to go dark. The White City did the opposite. As dusk came on, the fair began to glow. Thousands upon thousands of small electric bulbs traced every roofline, every arch, every dome, until the whole city was drawn in light against the black sky. Searchlights swept up off the rooftops. Far out over the water, the great wheel turned, ringed in fire. It was the largest display of electric light the world had ever seen, and it ran on alternating current, the system championed by Westinghouse and Tesla, the same kind of power that would go on to light the entire century to come. People stood in that light and could not speak. Some of them wept. They wrote letters home that night trying to describe it, and many of them reached for the very same word. They said they had seen the future, or something very close to heaven. For one summer, a drowned marsh on the edge of Lake Michigan had become the most dazzling city on earth, and almost no one standing in all that light understood that they were walking through something that was already dying.
Because the White City was never built to last.
Those gleaming marble palaces were not marble at all. They were plaster and fiber, spread over wood and painted white, made to shine for a single season and no longer. When the fair closed its gates that autumn, the dream was already over. And the following year, fire swept through the abandoned grounds and took most of the White City with it. The palaces that millions had walked through in wonder, gone almost as quickly as they had risen. Almost all of it. One building survived. The old Palace of Fine Arts had been built a little more solidly than the rest, and it still stands today on the Chicago lakefront, reborn as the Museum of Science and Industry, the last ghost of the White City, the one piece of the dream the fire could not take. But the idea never burned. The White City lit a fire in the people who had seen it. It launched a movement to make real cities more beautiful. And the man who had built it, Daniel Burnham, would spend his later years drawing grand plans to remake Chicago itself. Make no little plans, that was his creed, and the electric light that had seemed like a miracle that one summer, within a generation, it was everywhere. The palaces were never real. The marble was plaster, the columns were paint, the whole shining city built to last a single summer. But the wonder was real. A city that had burned to ashes had shown the world the future, and then quietly let it go. The crowds went home, the lights went dark, and somewhere beneath the grass on the shore of Lake Michigan, the White City is still there, not gone, only waiting for the lights to come back on.
Chicago built a temporary white city out of plaster and electric light to show the world a perfect future.
But across the ocean, Birmingham built a permanent empire out of red brick and toxic smoke that slowly consumed its own people. Watch my reconstruction of Birmingham to see the dark side of progress.
Subscribe to join our community of history lovers. See you on the next journey.
Before we finish, I want to take a moment to recognize the people appearing on screen right now. To the members of this channel, thank you so much. Your ongoing support is what motivates me and helps keep this project alive. If you enjoy what we do here and would like to directly support the channel, I invite you to click the Join button down below. To our members and to everyone who is simply watching this video, thank you for your time.